Eric Carter was obsessed. Laura Carter was terrified. Raymond Carter was dead. What began as a seemingly normal family dynamic turned into a nightmare fueled by obsession, betrayal, and murder. A son's dark desires led him to kill his own father, believing it would bring him closer to the woman he loved, his stepmother. But as his twisted plan unraveled, the horrifying truth came to light, ending in a deadly confrontation no one saw coming. Raymond Carter had always been a reserved man, someone who kept to himself and focused on providing for his family. After the tragic loss of his first wife, he had spent years alone, carrying the weight of grief. But when he met Laura, something changed. She was young, vibrant, and full of life, qualities he hadn't known he needed until she entered his world. It wasn't long before they married, and for the first time in years, Raymond allowed himself to be happy again. To outsiders, their relationship seemed ideal. Raymond found companionship, and Laura found stability. But within the walls of their home, an unseen tension was growing, one that neither of them suspected. That tension came from Eric, Raymond's 24-year-old son. He had always been distant from his father, never fully able to connect with him. The death of his mother had left a hole in his life, one that he never managed to fill. When Laura arrived, something shifted in him, but it wasn't resentment. It was something far more dangerous. At first, Eric told himself it was admiration. Laura was beautiful, graceful, and kind. She had a warmth that he had rarely seen in his father's life, and he found himself drawn to her. When she laughed, it sent a strange excitement through him. When she touched his shoulder in passing, he lingered on the feeling longer than he should have. He convinced himself that it was harmless, that his fascination was normal. But it wasn't. Over time, Eric began obsessing over Laura in ways that made even him uncomfortable. He watched her from a distance, memorizing her movements, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear, the way she sighed when she was lost in thought. He started following her online, scrolling through her old pictures, reading her posts over and over again as if they were personal letters meant just for him. In his mind, Laura was not just his stepmother. She was someone he was meant to be with. The resentment toward his father grew. Every moment that Raymond and Laura spent together felt like a theft. His father was stealing what should have been his. Eric's fantasies became darker. He imagined a world where his father no longer existed, where he and Laura could be together without the barrier between them. These thoughts scared him at first, but the more he entertained them, the more they made sense. Family dinners became unbearable. He clenched his jaw as he watched his father place a hand on Laura's back or whisper something in her ear. He hated the way she looked at Raymond, the way she smiled for him. It wasn't fair. He was younger, stronger. Why couldn't she see that they were supposed to be together? The thoughts turned into plans. The plans turned into conviction. If fate wouldn't bring Laura to him, then he would take matters into his own hands. All he had to do was remove the obstacle in his way. Eric's thoughts had transformed from fleeting fantasies into something more concrete, something real. The idea of eliminating his father had once seemed unthinkable, but now it consumed his mind. He started seeing Raymond not as his father, but as an obstacle, a problem that needed to be solved. The more he dwelled on it, the more convinced he became that he was meant to do this. He began his research carefully, making sure to cover his tracks. Late at night, he scoured the internet, reading about crime scene investigations, forensic techniques, and undetectable murder methods. He learned how police determined time of death, what made a crime scene look like a burglary, and which weapons left the least evidence behind. His browser history became a collection of chilling search terms: how to make murder look like an accident, quickest way to kill someone, home invasion gone wrong. Each search only fueled his delusions. He debated various methods. Poison seemed ideal, quiet, untraceable, and relatively painless, but it required patience and careful planning. He didn't want to wait. A staged break-in was another possibility, but it would require creating a realistic crime scene. That meant noise, mess, and too many chances for things to go wrong. In the end, he decided that the simplest way was the best: a direct physical attack, a weapon he could wield with his own hands, something brutal, something final. The decision made him feel powerful. For the first time in his life, he was in control. He knew when it would happen, late at night, when his father was asleep, when the house was silent, when there would be no struggle. He knew how he would do it. A hammer, taken from the garage, heavy enough to crush bone but easy enough to discard later. He even knew how he would react afterward, shocked, horrified, the grieving son who had just discovered his father's body. The night of the murder arrived faster than he expected. His heart pounded, but his hands were steady as he walked through the dimly lit house. The hammer felt cold in his grip, reassuringly solid. As he reached his father's bedroom door, he paused for only a second before pushing it open. Raymond lay still, his breaths deep and even. He had no idea that his own son was standing over him, weapon in hand, prepared to end his life. Eric hesitated for only a moment. Then, without a word, he lifted the hammer and brought it down with all his strength. The first strike landed with a sickening crack. Raymond's body jerked, his eyes fluttering open in confusion and pain. But before he could react, the hammer came down again, and again. By the time it was over, Eric was breathing heavily, his arms shaking from exertion. The room smelled of blood, thick and metallic. He forced himself to move quickly, ransacking drawers, pulling out valuables, breaking a window, anything to make it look like a robbery. Then, when he was sure everything was in place, he picked up his phone and dialed 911, his voice trembling with perfectly rehearsed panic. The moment Eric hung up the phone, the weight of what he had done hit him. But instead of fear or regret, he felt something unexpected, relief. His father was gone. The only thing that mattered now was ensuring no one ever suspected him. When the police arrived, Eric played the part of the devastated son flawlessly. His hands trembled, his breaths came in sharp, uneven gasps. He told them he had come home late and found the house in disarray. The broken window, the missing valuables, the bloodied body of his father, it all pointed to a burglary gone terribly wrong. Officers asked him routine questions, but his answers were calm and calculated. He was cooperative, grief-stricken, and most importantly, convincing. Laura arrived shortly after, her face pale, her hands covering her mouth in horror. She collapsed onto the couch, sobbing, unable to process the brutal loss of her husband. Eric sat beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulder, whispering soft reassurances. This was his moment, his chance to step in and be her protector. In the days that followed, Eric ensured that he was always there for Laura. He handled the funeral arrangements, managed the police interviews, and took care of the legal paperwork. Laura, overcome with grief, leaned on him more than ever. He comforted her, offered a strong shoulder to cry on, and made sure she knew she wasn't alone. At first, she saw him as nothing more than a stepchild trying to cope with the loss of a parent. But Eric had other plans. He slowly started shifting their dynamic, inserting himself into every aspect of her life. He brought her coffee in the mornings, cooked dinner in the evenings, and sat with her late at night when she couldn't sleep. He wanted to be the one she depended on, the one she trusted most. As weeks passed, he grew bolder. He started making subtle comments, harmless at first, but with an underlying suggestion. He spoke about how fate had a strange way of working, how people who suffered loss could find comfort in each other. He reminded her of how well they understood each other, how they had both lost the same man, and how their pain connected them. Laura was too caught up in her grief to notice the shift right away. But when Eric started standing too close, touching her arm a little too long, looking at her in ways that made her uncomfortable, she began to sense something was wrong. At first, she ignored it, assuming he was just struggling emotionally. But then came the moment that made everything clear. One night, as they sat together on the couch, Eric turned to her with an intensity in his eyes she had never seen before. He told her they were meant to be together, that his father's death had brought them closer for a reason. He spoke about a future, about love, about having a family of their own. Laura felt her stomach drop. This wasn't grief. This wasn't confusion. This was something twisted, something terrifying. And in that moment, she finally understood the horrifying truth. Eric wasn't just mourning his father. He had planned all of this, and now she was trapped in his delusion. Laura's blood ran cold as Eric's words sank in. She stared at him, hoping she had misheard, that this was some kind of sick joke. But the look in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. He meant every word. Fear crept through her veins as she realized just how deep his obsession ran. This wasn't just grief twisting his emotions. This was something much darker. He had been waiting for this moment, for her to accept him, for her to become his. The thought made her sick. She forced herself to stay calm, to nod weakly, to mutter something about being overwhelmed, anything to keep him from suspecting that she was terrified. She needed time to think, to figure out a way to distance herself without pushing him over the edge. From that night on, Laura became hyper-aware of Eric's presence. She could feel his eyes on her constantly, watching her, studying her. She started locking her bedroom door at night, keeping her phone close at all times, and avoiding being alone with him whenever possible. She knew she needed help, but she had no proof. She couldn't walk into a police station and say she suspected her stepson had murdered his father because he was in love with her. Instead, she confided in a close friend. Over coffee, she hesitantly revealed her fears, whispering her suspicions as if saying them out loud made them more real. Her friend's reaction only confirmed what she already knew. She had to get away from him. But Eric was always watching. He noticed the way she pulled away, how she no longer met his eyes, how she made excuses to avoid spending time with him. It didn't take long for his obsession to morph into paranoia. Late one night, he went through her phone while she slept. His hands trembled with fury as he read her messages. She was planning to leave. She was talking about him, calling him disturbed, saying she was afraid. Betrayal hit him like a blade to the chest. He had done everything for her. He had eliminated his father for her, and now she was turning against him. The next morning, Laura sensed the change immediately. His usual forced charm was gone, replaced by cold, piercing silence. He barely spoke, his movements stiff and calculated. Every second in the house felt like walking on broken glass. That night she lay awake, her mind racing. She had to leave. She had to get out before it was too late. But before she could move, she heard footsteps outside her door. A slow, deliberate knock echoed through the silent house. Her heart pounded. She stayed frozen, barely breathing. Then the doorknob turned, locked. A beat of silence, then a quiet chuckle from the other side. She clutched the phone in her shaking hands. She had waited too long, Eric knew, and now she wasn't sure if she would make it out alive. Laura's breath was shallow as she lay frozen in bed, gripping her phone so tightly her fingers ached. The air in the room felt suffocating, thick with fear. The silence outside her door was almost worse than the sound of Eric's quiet chuckle. Was he still standing there, waiting? Or had he walked away? Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. Then the soft creak of floorboards told her he was moving. Not away, but closer. He was still there, still lurking. Laura forced herself to think. She couldn't stay trapped in this house with him. If she waited too long, she might not get another chance. Carefully, she pulled herself out of bed, moving as silently as possible. Her only option was to escape. Her heart pounded as she unlocked the window. It wasn't a long drop to the ground below. She could make it. Just as she swung one leg over the sill, a sudden noise made her freeze. The door handle rattled violently. Then came the banging, hard, frantic, furious. "Laura," Eric's voice called through the door, his tone eerily calm despite the aggression behind his knocks. "We need to talk." She didn't answer. She didn't wait. She pushed herself through the window, landing hard on the ground below. Pain shot through her ankle, but she forced herself to stand. The night air was cold, but the adrenaline pumping through her veins kept her moving. She had to get to the car. Behind her, a loud crash shattered the night. Eric had broken through the bedroom door. He knew she was gone. She didn't dare look back. She sprinted toward the driveway, ignoring the burning in her legs. Her fingers fumbled as she yanked open the car door, slamming it shut and locking it, just as she saw Eric appear in the doorway of the house. His face was wild with rage. Laura's hands shook as she turned the key in the ignition. The car roared to life, headlights illuminating the driveway. Eric didn't hesitate. He bolted toward her, his feet pounding against the pavement. Just as he reached for the door handle, Laura slammed her foot on the gas. The car lurched forward, tires screeching against the pavement. She didn't stop. She didn't slow down. She just drove, hands trembling, eyes darting to the rearview mirror, expecting to see him chasing after her. But he was gone. It wasn't until she reached the police station, breathless and shaking, that she realized how close she had come to dying that night. The investigation that followed unraveled the truth. With Laura's testimony, Eric's search history, and inconsistencies in his alibi, the police re-examined Raymond's murder. It didn't take long for the puzzle pieces to fall into place. The staged burglary, the missing weapon, the twisted obsession, Eric had planned everything. But in the end, his obsession had consumed him. His plan had failed. And instead of living out his fantasy, he had lost everything.